Welcome to the Vinnymark podcast, a collection of interviews with thought leaders of the wine world, brought to you by Vinnymark.
One of the things I wrote about in the report this year was seeing a number of black winemakers who are making their own wines under their own labels. And there's something like, I think, 12 wines in the 95 plus tasting who've not had a 95 plus wine before. I think Colombard has enormous potential in this market. People are getting a bit more adventurous and creative with what they're doing with their white blends and their reds. Having said that, I think South Africa's missing a bit of a trick when it comes to producing very good wines in large volume.
That was the voice of Master of Wine Tim Atkin, who was in Cape Town recently for the release of his South African wine guide for the year 2024. I got a chance to catch up with him to discuss some of his joys and concerns with the current state of the South African wine industry. It is my pleasure to be talking to Tim for the third year in a row. So, Tim, thank you so much for making time to chat to us today.
My pleasure, Jono. It's always fun to talk to you about wine and also coffee, because you're an expert on coffee as well.
One day we're going to have to actually do an interview over a cup of Rosetta coffee.
I think we should.
You've now written 12 reports on South African wine, and yet despite that being a fairly solid body of work, you still keep on discovering new things, new talents. So I wondered if we could kick off by just asking you if there have been one or two things that surprised you most to learn about South African wine within the last year.
Yeah, it's always good to come across new producers, particularly new young producers. It's more producers than regions, but a couple of regions as well. I mean, I was very excited this year. My white wine discovery of the year came from the Karoo, from Sutherland. So I think that was new to me. But also, one of the things I wrote about in the report this year was seeing a number of black winemakers who are making their own wines under their own labels. I'm thinking about Benele Bakele in particular, Timbela Wines. I think that was a new thing for me. It's reached critical mass. So lots of new things. And it's the kind of thing that keeps me coming back. It's not just tasting the wines that everybody knows and everybody knows I like, but new things that surprised me. And there's something like, I think, 12 wines in the 95 plus tasting who've not had a 95 plus wine before. Giant periwinkle from the Cape Agulhas area. I mean, it's fun. It's what keeps me coming back.
Now, when we chatted last year, we spoke about how the concept of a South African vintage was far too broad a topic, given how disparate all our various wards and districts are. So instead of me asking you for a vintage report, I want to know which regions or perhaps wine styles seem to have fared the best during the 22 and 23 vintages.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think 22, they're very contrasting vintages. That 22 was particularly hot. I mean, January was one of the hottest ever, with these amazing heat spikes. And I think it's how people dealt with the heat. A lot of vineyards actually in the heat shut down. I mean, the vineyards sometimes just don't like too much heat and they stop photosynthesizing. So I think it's how people dealt with heat in 22 was a very important thing. In 23, it was rain, but it depends where you were and when it rained. And some places had terrible rain really from the start of the year. I mean, my good friend Samantha O'Keefe in Grayton, I think she has something like 600 millimeters of rain between January and March. Other places, I mean, in the Swartland being a good example, it wasn't particularly wet in 2023. So what you said is correct, that increasingly rather than saying a broad brush approach, saying 23 was like this, 22 was like that, but you need to look within those regions and say, okay, maybe 2022, where you had these heat spikes, that the cooler regions were better. And the cooler regions would obviously be those at altitude, or it would be vineyards close to the two oceans. Particularly, really, I would say the Atlantic Ocean, but not exclusively. The other thing is aspect. I think there's something that's obviously south-facing is going to be cooler, and I think that areas, if we look at it within Stellenbosch, for example, like Fora, like Wraithby, like Firgrove, like the Sinai Hill, which is obviously within that area, or the Polkadry Hills, which faces False Bay, or they're on the corner of the Helderberg, again, getting that False Bay influence, those tend to fare better in those heat struck vintages. I think it's much harder if you're in a place like Porcelainberg, and Porcelainberg 2022, which is another absolutely brilliant wine and has got 99 points in my report this year, is brilliant farming. So I think if you're a really good farmer, you can farm well in the heat, but it's much, much harder in those vintages. Evan Sardi, and I quote him in the report, he said it really annoys him that wine writers say 2023 was X, 2024 was Y. He said you need to say not just what was it like in the Swartland, what was it like on the Perleberg as opposed to Riva Castile, for example. So I think you're right that we should be looking at maybe giving more detailed vintage assessments, whether it be as SA Wine or South Africa Wine, which is the generic body, or us as wine writers.
Which did you feel were the regions where a lack of quality was noted due to those conditions?
I think particularly in 23, lack of quality. I think that late harvested grape varieties in Stellenbosch, particularly certain clones of Cabernet Sauvignon, but also Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot struggled. And I think that it's not going to be a great year for Bordeaux cultivars generally in Stellenbosch. I think that Stellenbosch suffered. I had some stuff in 23 from the various Hemlenard Awards, which also wasn't that great. And talking to JC Martin from Creation, he said, "Oh, this is nothing. It rains more than this in Switzerland every vintage," and it's true. And it rains more than that in Bordeaux in many vintages. But I still think that 23 was a challenging vintage because of autumn rains, really. I mean, 22 there was actually decent water in the ground, so as long as you had irrigation in 22. I think that 22 wasn't too difficult. And I think the same thing is going to be true of 24.
Let's talk about 2024, just because having connected with a few winemakers over the last couple of weeks, I seem to get different reports, all from within Stellenbosch. So can we talk about 2024 specifically within Stellenbosch?
Yeah, we can. I mean, the problem is I haven't tasted most of the wines from that vintage. What I'm going on so far is what people are telling me anecdotally, and winemakers generally want to put good spins on vintages. But a lot of people are saying that 24, that the yields were down. It was a very small vintage, not as small as 23, but a much better quality vintage. Lots of people talking about really good quality grapes, very very good structure in the wines. I think that we're going to see some very exciting stuff. My hunch, from what they've told me, and I hope that's correct, is that 24 will be the best vintage that the Cape's had since 21. And before that, I think since 2017.
I've been tasting vintages from 2015 through to 2022. And I've been noticing again and again how the famous 2015 vintage seems to be more and more being outshone by some of the others that perhaps at the time weren't so broadly celebrated. My question to you is, as time has passed, have you been surprised by how some of the vintages from certain regions have shaped up or exceeded expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very good question. I think maybe we took 2015, looking back on it, it was the start of the drought. I think that by the time we got to 2017, we were in the middle of the drought, of that sort of 5-year drought, and people had learned how to deal with the conditions. So I think a lot of the 17s, they weren't identical vintages, but I think a lot of the 17s are better than the 15s and will age better. 19 was very tricky. I think 20 was COVID and it was hot and it was early. 21, I think, is better than some people said at the time. And I know some people preferred 22 and they were a bit more voluptuous maybe than the 21s. But I think 21 as a vintage is a really nice balanced vintage. And it's also good for both whites and reds. And I don't think that's the case for 23, which we've spoken about already, that I think the whites in 23 are much better than the reds, or the reds I've tasted so far. So I think if I had to put, the run of my 3 favourite vintages, I think I'd put 17 first, 21 second, and probably 15 third, even though the first 100-point wine that I ever gave was to the Port South 15, which has aged extremely well because I had a magnum of it recently. I think that 17, maybe I'd put my money into that, or 21, because there's still some 21s on the market.
Who do you consider to be your most exciting winemaker discoveries that are featured in this report for the first time? So that might not be your young winemaker of the year. Perhaps they are even fresher than that and haven't proved themselves yet, but just have that spark that you think we should be looking out for as South African wine lovers.
Yeah, I really like the new release from Nushka de Vos, which some of you may be familiar with her wines already because she was the winemaker at Reinecker, and she's now gone out on her own making a wine called Vulpes. And I thought that was really an outstanding discovery. And that's in my 95 plus tasting. The producer's been making wine for a long time, but I think that there's almost a new discovery for me because he's now doing things from new regions, is Johan Kruger. I think that Johan Kruger, he's not a young winemaker, but I would certainly give him a thumbs up as well. Also, Vanelli, we've mentioned Vanelli, and I think Vanelli is now into his 3rd vintage.
I wondered if there were any cultivars that you tasted for the first time in South Africa this vintage?
I haven't had a Pontac yet. I know Chris Alhart's planted some Pontac. One variety that I have tasted before but have not tasted so much of as a single cultivar is Colombar. And I think Colombar has enormous potential in this market. Albarino, there are a few producers, but I think Albarino is starting to get a little bit of critical mass. Assyrtiko really has started with Jordan, and I think Jordan doing a great job. I expect to see more of those. I think where we're seeing the innovation is in terms of blends, particularly white blends, but also red blends too. People using more of what Ferdi Visser of Olifantsberg calls the salt and pepper varieties. So little bits and pieces of things like Petit Syrah that they're blending in there. And I think people are getting a bit more adventurous and creative with what they're doing with their white blends and their reds. Things like Vermentino in whites, or using a bit more Grenache Blanc or Marsanne, pushing the envelope with those, what we could loosely call Mediterranean or Rhone style varieties.
So in South Africa, we have a historically tragic performance in the market with white blends. And yet, obviously, in the trade, white blends are some of the most celebrated wines. So it's great to hear you talk about that. I would just love to get your thoughts on how we get wine lovers to drink white blends.
It's a very good question. I think it's sort of the Riesling phenomenon in a way, that Riesling is loved by people like you and me and by sommeliers and wine geeks, but the general public doesn't get it. And I think that white blends is the same thing. And maybe white blends are just too complicated to get your head around it. It's much easier to say this is a Sauvignon Blanc from Darling or Durbanville or whatever. Having said that, I think they're phenomenal. If you put them in front of people, you get the Rocking Horses, you get the Palladiuses, you get those sorts of wines out there. People do love drinking them. It's just maybe they can't be bothered to remember the names of the varieties or care that much about the varieties. But if you can get the wines in their hands, then the right consumers will drink them. But I take your point. Maybe we need more top end producers like Ibn, like John Seckham, like Chris Alhite to get behind white blends and really shout about them. Or maybe we need some of the bigger companies to get behind them. And I mean, Bellingham do it, I think, and do a decent job with it.
I'm glad you raised that point about bigger brands, because I know that a lot of your top scoring wines in South Africa specifically often are produced in tiny quantities. And I wanted to get your insights into producers who may not be the 97, 98s in the Tim Atkin guide, but who you back to be able to produce consistent quality, but also to be able to do so with wines that are producing more than 100,000 bottles per vintage. Are there producers like that stand out for you?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I think DGB makes some very good stuff. I think the KWV makes some great stuff. I think some of the co-ops are really good. Peterberg Wines making some great stuff. I think that the Darling co-op, I think some of the Swartland co-ops, I think the co-ops are a good place to find good value and comparatively large volumes. And they might not be getting 95s or 97s, but they can certainly get 92s, 93s sometimes, and they're very good value for money wines. Having said that, I think South Africa's missing a bit of a trick when it comes to producing good wines or very good wines in large volumes. And an obvious exception would be something like the Chocolate Block. I mean, Chocolate Block sells at a comparatively good price. In other words, profitable for the producer. It means that they can invest in vineyards, in their people, and all those things. I think that Rupert and Rothschild with Classique would be a good example. Maybe what Canoncop is doing with its range of different cadet wines. I think all of those are comparatively large volume wines that offer reasonably good value for money, really. So I think the value for money is out there, but I take your point that most of the really top wines in this country are produced in tiny quantities, and it's a shame. And it pains me sometimes that more people can't get to taste the footpad. That you've basically got to be on Evan's mailing list to get, if you're lucky, 3 bottles of the footpad, and that's it. I'd like the whole world to be able to taste the footpad because it's such an incredible wine.
Many of the bigger brands that you mentioned there, DGB, KWV, Swartland Co-op specifically, all of them have people that I deem to be really progressive, fascinating, committed winemakers. And sometimes they get lost in the brands that carry them. I wondered if you would be willing to perhaps talk to the specific little niche of the market of winemakers who are doing really good jobs who have impressed you working within that co-op system?
I think it's very difficult for them to stand out. But in some ways, I think it's actually more difficult to make a huge blend of something than it is to make, one single, I don't know, a barrel or something from a quarter of a hectare of vines on the Paardeberg or something like that. And maybe somebody like me should be giving more credit to those people. And I think somebody who doesn't get the credit she deserves is Elle from the KWV, who's doing some fantastic things there. DGB tends to be a bigger group of people. It's obviously not just one winemaker, and the same thing's really true of the KWV too. But DGB, I think Stéphane Joubert, as a viticulturist who also has a strong hand in the winemaking, is obviously a key figure. And I think DGB for me is one of the most progressive forces for good in this country. I really think it's doing a better job, frankly, than Heineken Beverages are doing. I don't know what's going to happen to them now under the new ownership, which is obviously Dutch, and whether they're going to seek to invest more in their wine brands. And I'd like to think that they will, because I think a brand like Niederberg still has a lot of untapped potential. Going back to the time when Günter Brutzel was making the wines there, and he's obviously my legend in the report this year.
Yeah, so can you tell me a little bit more about what led you to Günter Brutzel in this particular year? Were there some elements that you learnt about him anew, or was it just something that you felt it was about time?
No, I mean, an element of about time, but the main catalyst for it really was a conversation I had with Carl Schultz at Hartenberg, and we were talking about what winemakers had brought to the industry. And I said, well, it's amazing that Neil Ellis, in particular, who has been a winemaking legend in my report before, was sort of undervalued in many ways. You know, that he was the first person to make wine in Elgin, I think, the first person to make wine from Groenekloof. He was the first person, I think, to put his own name on a brand as a winemaker. And he said, well, people often forget about Günter Brutzel. He said Günter Brutzel was our first rock star winemaker at Niederberg. And I said, good point. And because I haven't seen him for a long time, I think I met him when he was at Niederberg. He's long retired now because he's 90 this year. I'd forgotten about him. And I think maybe this award should have gone to him, 5 years ago. But it was just Carl reminding me about Günter. And then I read a piece that Emil Joubert had written on his 90th birthday and thought, this guy really made a difference. He was a key figure in the history of South African wine. And, he came here from Germany as a young man. And I thought, time to interview him. And so he's coming tonight. And not only is he coming to receive his award, but he's also going to stay on and taste all the wines in the room. So I hope when I'm 90 years old, assuming I survive that long, I'm still up for tasting 200 wines on a hot day in Cape Town.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people who wouldn't agree to stay at your 95 tasting. Having chatted a little bit about the people in this report, I wanted us to shift our attention back specifically to the wines that have impressed you. When it comes to red wines and the categories that performed best, can you give us some insight on those?
I think the Swartland and Stellenbosch again have emerged as the leading regions, particularly for red wines. For white wines, it's a bit more of a mixed picture. Within that, the two strongest categories have again been Syrah and Bordeaux style wines. I mean, I use that term Bordeaux style because they might be blends, or they might be Cab Francs, or they might be more, in some cases, pure Cabernets. The other things I would look out for, Cinsault, I think is getting better and better. I've had, surprised me, more Merlots than ever did well this year. And Pinotage, I think that Pinotage is kind of coming up on the inside track, if you like, in South Africa, that it is uniquely South African. Bearing in mind its parents are Pinot Noir and Cinsault, people treat it like a Pinot Noir or a Cinsault rather than treating it like a Cabernet Sauvignon and trying to extract more from it. I think the new wave Pinotages we're seeing, Angus Pauls and the Lucinda Haynes at Ilimis and places like that, are making some really interesting Pinotages. I think what Bernard Bradella is doing is incredible, and I think he's an underrated producer still.
It's interesting that you mentioned Cinsault again, because I think at large in South Africa it had this moment in the limelight, and everyone was making very light, ethereal, single parcel Cinsauts, and much talked about. And then it feels like it's gone off the boil a little bit, and it hasn't really been top of mind, or at least not in the media. And so I'm glad to hear you mention that. Are you able to perhaps give a little more detailed insight onto regions or winemakers?
Absolutely. Well, the two supreme examples really would be made by Duncan Savage with Follow the Line and Evan with Pofat, I think are superb Cinsauts. I'd also give enormous credit to Alex Milner at Natif Allais. He makes a number of them from different regions, as well as a Cape blend from Cinsault. I think he's done fantastic things. A lot of people are making these lighter style, more elegant Cinsauts, whether it be, and principally I would say, sort of darling a little bit of Swartland. I think what Ardi's doing with his two single vineyard, single parcel Cinsauts are amazing, and they're both brilliant in this vintage as well. Those guys are leading the way. Cinsault also is a variety that can produce comparatively inexpensive wine well, and it kind of goes from tutti frutti stuff, which is easy to drink and fun, to I think quite profound wines.
Another sort of winemaking trend that perhaps was a little more celebrated 3 or 4 years ago was the reference to South Africa's history with Cabernet Cinsault. And there were these tribute wines that were being produced. And again, there was a sort of fresh excitement around a category that in a weird way could be uniquely South African. But there hasn't been any particular one that has stood out. I wondered if you'd come across any of the Cabernet Cinsault blends that have impressed you.
I like the wine that Lariche make, the Fogelsang. I think is a very nice blend of Cabernet and Cinsault. There might be some other stuff in it as well. I can't remember offhand because I haven't got my report in front of me. But I think that's been a welcome addition to the range. And they're also releasing it with a bit of age. And I think that's really good to show that, as you talking about these old wines from the 50s and 60s and 70s and earlier, sometimes the Chateau Libertases of this world are part of the history of South Africa. And I think that those Cabernet Cinsault blends have got more mileage in them, and because they're uniquely South African.
You also mentioned that Bordeaux blends were perhaps shining a little more brightly than the classic Stellenbosch Cabernet Sauvignon. Can you tell me a little bit about why you think that is?
Cabernet Sauvignon, despite being arguably the most famous and I think the most planted red wine grape variety in the world, it is a variety that needs friends to me. I always find it a bit uptight. It almost needs something to give it a few more curves and a few less edges. I can't think of that many examples in the world, really, where it's a pure Cabernet where I think wouldn't be improved by the addition of other varieties. I mean, not necessarily Merlot, because I don't think Merlot is a strong variety in the Cape for various reasons. But I think Cab Franc, Malbec, Petit Verdot, the other four varieties, and you could include Carmenere, although not many people have got that here. I think all of those things add nuances and just a little bit more interest to Cabernet as a blend. I always think Cabernet Sauvignon on its own is a bit monolithic. Having those other things makes it a bit more approachable and a little bit more complex.
Now, there has been a historical reputation with Stellenbosch to be the number one region for Cabernet Sauvignon in South Africa, but it feels like that perhaps there are a couple of other wards or districts producing Cabernet Sauvignon that is arguably better than those coming out of Stellenbosch. Would you agree with that assertion, or do you feel that Stellenbosch is still king?
No, I think Stellenbosch is still king with those varieties. I think it's what Stellenbosch does best. You could argue that Syrah in certain pockets, and also Chenin Blanc closer to the ocean, and also Cinsault. I think that what Stellenbosch does best tends to be Cabernet and Cabernet-based blends, particularly from the Helderberg and Simonsberg.
You talked about Cabernet needing fewer angles and more curves, and I've been noting just a couple of the warmer regions producing some rich, although not monolithic Cabernet Sauvignons. And just like we are beginning to explore the idea that perhaps Pinotage is better in a cooler region, I began to ask myself, is it not a case perhaps that Cabernet might be something that in South Africa has more curves from some slightly warmer regions?
Yeah, somewhere like Wellington, maybe. I mean, people tend to think of Wellington as only being as a hot climate area, but it's not. There are bits within Wellington which are obviously cooler and higher, and I think that's certainly one area. I think Paarl. I mean, again, people think that Paarl is monolithic, and I don't think it is. That the higher bits of Paarl on Paarl Mountain are actually quite cool, and bits of Simonsberg Paarl. We've not really mentioned that, but the other side of Paarl, on the back of the Simonsberg, again, some really good stuff happening there, and that's potentially prime Cabernet territory.
So turning our attention to the white wines, Chenin Blanc has always been your top of the pile. Would you say that has remained?
Yes, it has. Yeah, I think Chardonnay is catching up. There are more Chardonnays than ever in the report of very high quality, but I think that Chenin is the grape variety, white and red, really, that best expresses the range of soil types and terroirs and subregions and altitude and proximity to the ocean, all those sorts of things. I just think that it's the Cape's most distinctive variety.
You mentioned earlier with the reds that Stellenbosch and Syrah were emerging as still leaders as far as wine regions. If you were to give the title of best regions for Chenin, would you still be sitting with Swartland and Stellenbosch?
I think I'd probably go specifically with the Paardenberg, actually, and then bits of the West Coast, which are kind of lumped together as Citrusdal Mountain. But Citrusdal Mountain is a very large area which covers everything from the Skurfberg, as it's known, down to where the late Henk Lang's farm is. The West Coast generally, I think, has enormous potential for Chenin. But I think the Swartland and the bit of Stellenbosch, as I said, closer to the ocean, is a fantastic region for Chenin Blanc, particularly the Rustenhof farm, which is where my white wine of the year this year comes from, which is Nautical Dawn, which is Chris Alhei's wine, which is, I think, one of the kind of Grand Cru sites of the Cape.
You also mentioned Chardonnay as being something that has been very impressive. Can you drill down a little bit into some of the regions and perhaps some of the winemakers who've impressed you most with their Chardonnays?
Yeah, I think Elgin is particularly good, and I think Hemelanada, and obviously the Hemelanada would be known for a number of brands, some of which have established a long-term reputation, and Hamilton Russell consistently produces great stuff. I think Restless River, we've mentioned that. I think the stuff that the Newton Johnsons are doing, again, would be very strong. Within Elgin, I was very pleased this year that Oak Valley's, I think, really producing some fantastic wines under Jacques, and I think that Richard Kershaw, obviously the clonal king, is making lots of different Chardonnays from different clones and combinations with different soil types. I think what the Kluvers are doing, or Andries Berger at Paul Kluwer, is fantastic in Elgin as well. In Stellenbosch, I think you're really looking principally that sort of western edge, if you like, of the Helderberg, where Longridge are, where the Molyneux get their Chardonnay from, where Overmira are. I think that kind of corner, that cool corner that's influenced by False Bay, is a very good area within Stellenbosch for making Chardonnays. The one that surprised me, as I said to you earlier, was wine from Johan Kruger, which was this wine from Sutherland in the Glencarew. And I think that's interesting to see how these wines at altitude are going to fare in the future. I mean, in the past, I've rewarded the wine that De Grendel make from Ceres, the Op de Berg Chardonnay, and this year again they got 94 points. I think some of the Cape South Coaster stuff, I think down there is Sondas Kloof. I think that's an exciting area. Principally, these are cooler climate areas.
I know that you spend a lot of time in the New World in countries like Argentina and Chile and even Uruguay. Given that South African wine producers are still under a lot of financial pressure, are there marketing techniques or communication styles or even just unique business models that you see in some of those countries that perhaps South African producers could be learning from?
The answer is that, you think you're in a bad position, but lots of other places are in as bad a position and way worse. I mean, I don't write about Australia, but Australia has 2.2 billion litres of wine currently sitting in bottles and tanks at the moment, which is surplus. So they've got huge problems. Last week, I was on holiday in Spain, but I spoke by video link to a conference in Chile about the ongoing crisis in the Chilean wine industry. The Chile is looking currently at uprooting 30,000 hectares out of its about 130,000 hectares of vineyards. So they're thinking about losing nearly 25% of what they've got in the ground. I think the problems we think are unique to South Africa are actually global problems. There's too much wine in the world. People generally are drinking less wine, although there's a certain degree of evidence to say they're drinking better. So I don't think that what's happening here is necessarily all that bad. Profitability is still a problem, but I think having fewer vineyards or a smaller area under vine, and I think that the plan is to get down to 85,000 hectares over the next couple of years, partly by people just giving up on viticulture, but also switching to other crops or just uprooting vineyards, is going to make things a bit easier. I still think South African wine is too cheap. And part of the problem is that the wine it produces cheaply is almost too good for its own good, that there is no reason for somebody to trade up from an £8 bottle of wine to a £15 bottle of wine. You've got to give people a reason. I think what we're seeing is a shift in generation. I think people of your generation and the generation that's younger than you, they're much more motivated by what we might call ethical issues, that people think about sustainability, they think about the way things are farmed, they think about the way people treat their labor force. And I think that could potentially play into South Africa's hand. If South Africa gets that right, I think people will buy into that message. And Chile's not really done that. Argentina's got a different set of problems. And the main one is its economy and inflation. The inflation in Argentina is sometimes as high as 300% per year. And that makes it very difficult for Argentina to play in the cheap end of the market. And that's been a good thing for Argentina, that by default, it's had to sell its wines at higher prices. And I think that would be a good thing for South Africa if for some reason the bottom end of the market was almost rendered so uneconomic by economic circumstances that people said, there's no point in producing this wine anymore. I cannot make any money out of it. And therefore, the average price point of South African wine, which is the second lowest in the world in terms of bottle packaging, packaged product of the 11 major exporters in the world, only Spain is lower. South Africa's price is too low for its own good. And so it has to find some way of getting that up. And I think that learning from what's happened to Argentina and, force majeure really in Argentina, that the economy was so bad that people had to charge more for the wines because of inflation. That would not be a bad thing here if people just were forced to sell their wines at higher prices.
I suppose the big problem is the dependence on the local market, where market elasticity for the price of wine is at an all-time low. It would be a good thing internationally, but
yeah, I think you would build it internationally. But I think there's potential here. As you said, the average price of a bottle of wine in this market is probably 40 rand. It might be 50 rand, but I think something like 85% of the wine sold here would be under 50 rand. You can buy 5-litre bag in box of drinkable wine. It might be a bit sweet. For 100 rand, that's 20 rand a litre, litre that is. So it's very cheap, and there is a market for that wine. A lot of people living in this country do not have lots of money to spend on wine. There is an alcohol problem, I know, and some people are using cheap wine as a way to forget their problems and to get drunk. But I still think that the local market has more potential in it to increase the average price point. If we could move that up from 50 to 60 rand or 70 rand, just think what a massive difference that would make to the marketplace. Having said that, I think the biggest wins, as you say, are going to be on export markets.
You did mention the importance of environmental messaging, whether it's regenerative agriculture or organic wines or fair trade wines. And one of the producers that does that really well in South Africa is Bosman Family Vineyards. And they are also your viticulturalist of the year. Can you tell me a little bit about the thought process that went into naming a producer as viticulturalist of the year?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I thought, why not, really? But I've been fortunate to go there for quite an extended visit, actually, over twice in the last 3 years. One year, we really focused on research and development, and they're doing a lot of that in their nursery. This year, I spent a lot of time partly taking photographs, but also talking to people about the cultivars, so the vine material that they're supplying to the industry. A third of the vine material that's supplying to the South African wine industry comes from Bosman. They're doing amazing work in terms of new varieties they're planting, which are drought and potentially heat resistant. Again, an important characteristic, I think, in this climate change environment in which we live. And a lot of these varieties I've never even heard of. So I think Bosman are doing very good research that benefits not just their own business, but also the industry. They make extremely good wines. They've done great things with Nero d'Avola. Their Opton Horse Chenin Blanc is one of our 95 plus point wines this year for the first time. But the other thing I really wanted to emphasize was the transformation element. This is the biggest, I think it's the second biggest transformation project in the Western Cape in terms of viticulture. And I think that it really benefits the community. I think they've got something like 550 employees, farm community across the various farms, 3,500 people. They've got creches. They put people through schools in Wellington. They've had graduates from university. There's healthcare facilities, and it's basically paying people dividends who work on the farm. And the amount of time you spend there, also you get paid a greater dividend. So to me, it's an exemplary project in terms of transformation. It's putting something back in to the community, that the whole community benefits from the success of the business. And I think that the Bosmans, Petrus Bosman and his family, but also Colia Fourie, who's the fantastic winemaker at Bosman, deserve an enormous amount of credit. So I thought, why not give it to a winery and a group of people and what they've achieved together rather than just giving it to a single individual. So I broke with tradition.
I mean, what the Bosmans have done, they're incredibly innovative, and they've really broken ground and are really just kind of poster children for what South African wine producers should be. I also feel like there is a small, quite anonymous group of people in the South African wine industry who are, in the strictest sense, viticulturalists. They don't make wine, they don't own land, they are supremely focused on staying up to date with the cutting edge in soil science, microbial advancements, vineyard pruning and solar radiation analyses. And they eat, sleep, live, breathe this stuff. And I wondered if there isn't room for you to reserve an award that is specifically for these guys who are concerned with nothing beyond the plant itself, the vine. Because I think we need people who are that focused on those particular things. So that was just a side question, is can we have an award for viticulturalists specifically?
Yeah, because you're right that normally the person who wins it is a grower. I mean, viticulturists have won it. I mean, the award is for viticulturist stroke grower. Marco Ventrella won it one year from the KWV, who's an outstanding viticulturist. Jan Reinek has won it one year, again, outstanding viticulturist who also, is involved in making wines. But I've had growers win it. Willy Mostert won it last year. So, yeah, maybe I should have viticulturist and grower. I don't know, but maybe people say it's got too many awards already. But there are people that you mentioned. I mean, Etienne Blanche would be one of them. Jaco Engelbrecht, who is just focused on viticulture. Those people, they will be honoured in time. Don't worry, assuming that the report keeps going for as long as I do. And Jaco, if you're listening, they will get their honour.
You said if the report keeps going. I've seen that you have people like Beth Zimmer and Gabby Willard and Margaret Rand who have been producing work for you in the last few years in some of the reports. I wondered if there were members of your team who you have been prepping to perform a similar role in South Africa in the future?
Not yet. I mean, my number two, if you like, is Beth Willard. And Beth Willard is a Spanish specialist and now lives in Madrid. Beth is such a good taster that she could do anywhere. I'm still looking a little bit, because, as you rightly say, that I can't do this forever. I like to think that I'm immortal, but I'm not. It's also physically very demanding to do this, that I'm here for 4.5 weeks a year and I'm tasting, nearly 2,500 wines. So if you do the maths, that's kind of 600 or so a week, which is a lot of booze to put inside your body. And I have to make sure that I stay reasonably fit to do it. So at some point, I may need some help. I don't know whether that would be somebody or a team of people, but the strength of the report, I think, is that it's written by one person. I think the strength of the report is that you get one palate tasting the wine. And Platter, however good the Platter report is, and I have a lot of time for the Platter report, it's 13 different palates, and therefore you've got to factor that in, that people like different things. And then my report, people can look at it and say, okay, they may like my palate or they may not like my palate, but they know what my palate likes. If anybody's got any suggestions for other people who might like to help me in the future, I'm certainly now tasting with Kiara Scott, and she joins me on the what we call the discovery tastings for 3 days. And Kiara's been a great help there. So it's been nice to have a young winemaker giving me a sort of winemaker's perspective on some stuff. But for the time being, it's still me, folks. You're stuck with me. Sorry.
No, we long may it last. I think more thinking about Robert Parker's legacy managed to live on beyond him, and Jancis has found a way to semi-detach herself from the thing that she built. And so I think we're just wanting to, just keep you on your toes, make sure you've got a plan.
If anybody wants to offer me several million quid for the business, then I'd be very happy to speak to them.
We're definitely asking because the work you do is so important, and we appreciate all the time that you pour into this country.
That's very kind of you say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you again for another great year of service to us, and also for the time you've given me today.
That's all right. They were good questions.
Thank you, Tim.
See you soon.
Cheers, Tim.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vinimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the Vinimark channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.